I'm in a war. I've been in a war all my life, and I'll continue to be in one until the day that Jesus Christ comes to take me home. I did not enlist in a war, nor did I wish to be in one. The war started when Lucifer, once the most beautiful archangel, in his hubris, thought that he should be worshipped and exalted above God. He incited a rebellion in the kingdom of heaven. He was banished along with 1/3 of the angels to hell. Lucifer later came to be known as Satan. Satan hates God, but he cannot hurt God directly, so he goes after his creation, us. We are made in the image and likeness of God, so it aggrieves God greatly whenever any of his creation suffers. I was a pretty shy kid growing up, but at the same time, I wanted to make friends. I wanted to be accepted and fit in. Around like the 3rd grade, I started to hang out with some kids in my class, and we had fun. I would have sleepovers. They would sleep over at my house. I would sleep over at their house. And, we would have a lot of fun. But unfortunately, a lot of these kids were bad influences on me. They would act out in class. They would pressure me to act out in class. So I did that, and, I would get demerits and detentions. We would engage in all kinds of mischief, and this continued pretty much on until 8th grade. And fast forward to high school, I'm still hanging out with some of these same kids who are a bad influence, and there was even more bad influences in my high school class. And we were still engaging in the same kind of mischief, but, then around the same time, we started, they were drinking and pressuring me to drink. And I didn't want to at first, but, peer pressure became too much for me. I remember I went to one party and someone actually put a drink in my hand. And so I drank it. And then one of my friends had a big party, and there was like 100 people there. There was lights and dancing, and there was beer and hard alcohol. And I was there. I never experienced anything like that before. And I got intoxicated, and I loved it. I loved the feeling of it. And I loved the social aspect of it. I love just being around all these people. So then fast forward to sophomore year, and still hanging around with a lot of the same people, and some people in my class are smoking marijuana. And some of my friends pressured me to try it. They said, "Oh yeah, Neil, you'll be hilarious." So I tried it my sophomore year. It was around this time that I started to become pretty popular. I was having parties at my house. I would go to other people's houses for parties, and I would smoke weed and I would drink here and there. And then but it's funny, around this time, when I was a sophomore, toward the end of the year, I had this urging in my spirit from the Holy Spirit to stop smoking weed. He pretty much told me, Neil, you don't need to smoke weed, you don't need to drink to fit in, people like you as you are. I don't know, I just thought that, I wasn't really good at too much during this time in my life. I didn't really know what I was good at, and I didn't really have too much self-confidence or like a sense of self-efficacy. So I ignored the Holy Spirit's warning, and I just continued to do this stuff thinking that, that was my identity, and, that's what made me cool. So I continued on. My junior year, I started to feel depressed, and, I was drinking more junior year. I was smoking weed more, and I was feeling depressed. I didn't really know why, but, in my foolishness, I just continued to just do the things that I'd been doing, not realizing that the alcohol and the drugs were the cause of my problems. But then when we got to my senior year, I was totally off the rails. I pretty much had psychosis by this point. I was drinking all the time, smoking, and I just was completely not myself. I just was acting, I pushed everyone away from me, and I was just acting totally foolish. If you ask anyone who went to high school with me, they can tell you I was a very foolish person, and my behavior was like that of a lunatic. And I was accepted to Westchester University. When I was a freshman in college, I was doing a lot of the same stupid stuff. I was still hanging out with like bad influences, some of them from high school, and I met some new people. I was partying regularly on the weekends, drinking and smoking. It's not much really changed. And, this whole time between the ages of 17 and 20, I had actually racked up 5 arrests. I was arrested for underage drinking 3 times, 2 arrests for possession of drug and drug paraphernalia, And in one of these incidents, I also had a summary offense harassment for getting in a fist fight with my neighbor. And I just got into all other types of encounters with law enforcement and, with authority figures. And a certain point came during my sophomore year where I just kind of didn't like myself. I looked in the mirror, I didn't like what I was seeing, and I knew something had to change. And, this whole time too, my dad had been, trying to give me the come to Jesus talk, him and my mom. My dad would make me sit with him and watch Joyce Meyer and other evangelists, and he would make me listen to evangelists on the radio. And slowly over time, it just sank in, it just, it just kind of softened me up a little bit. And, I kind of realized that, I could have the power of God in my life if I so chose. So I started to slowly, it didn't happen overnight, but slowly I started to cut some poisonous fruit off the tree. I started to spend more time with my family and, study more. I immediately stopped smoking marijuana, and I didn't really go out and party as much. By the time I got to my junior year, I was commuting anyway, so I didn't really have time to be going out much. I was just focused on my studies and working. And, God really turned it around for me. I did really well my junior and senior year. I was, my grades were high. My professors liked me, and, I actually got an internship with Norristown Police Department, Criminal Investigation Division, summer after my senior year. And I did well at that internship. I made a lot of good connections that I still have to this day. And one of my professors, he actually recommended that I pursue my master's degree in criminal justice. And so I did that. I stayed an extra year and a half, got the master's degree. And then 6 months after that, I was hired by the Pennsylvania State Parole Board in June of 2016. Now, God had to work a miracle in order for me to even get hired in the first place. When I took the civil service test, I scored a 93 in the greater Philadelphia area. That's pretty much Philadelphia, Montgomery, Bucks, Berks, Delaware, and Chester County. I scored higher than 1,593 people, but here's the kicker. I scored lower than 133 people. Somehow I was called in for an interview with the Philadelphia district office. Now, I did pretty good during the interview. I answered their questions. However, I was grilled extensively on my criminal record. And, I did retort that by saying, well, look, I did make mistakes, but at the same time, the criminal justice system, because of their interventions, I actually was able to turn my life around. And I said, you're the parole board. Isn't that what you do? Isn't that, don't you rehabilitate people and, make sure, they turn into law-abiding citizens? So I said to him, I'm just proof that your system works. And next thing you know, they actually hired me. But it's worth mentioning that my dad was an insurance agent for Farmers Insurance, and he had a woman working for him. This woman, her husband was a parole agent and a safety trainer. He was a very respected parole agent in the state parole board, and he had considerable sway. So my dad put me in touch with him, and I told him what happened during the interview, and he said, oh, okay, well, I know the guys who interviewed you. I can give them a call. So he did, and then next thing I know, I was moved on to the background investigation phase. I was honest about my background with my investigator, filled out the packet truthfully, and and I passed the background investigation. I was appointed to the State Parole Academy and was sworn in as a state parole agent 2 months later. And I actually graduated as valedictorian of my class. I went on to have a fruitful career with state parole. I was a very diligent parole agent. I was very enforcement oriented and stayed on top of my guys. My supervisor told me I was the most enforcement oriented agent in the unit. I drug tested my guys, and I would catch things that other agents missed. And oftentimes I established rapport with my parolees by sharing my testimony with them. I actually shared my testimony with my problem guys and girls, that the ones that I even had to sanction and arrest. But it's funny though, when I shared my testimony, a lot of these guys and gals who seemed to be kind of, hard toward me and, not very receptive, when I shared the testimony, they softened up a lot. And, when they realized that I was just trying to help them, that I was, coming at them from a position of love, they were much more receptive to me. After 1.5 years, I was recruited by the chairman of the parole board to be his executive assistant. That's a big deal because to be a parole supervisor, you need 3 years of experience as a parole agent. I was recruited to be the chairman's right-hand man just 1.5 years after being on the job. And I didn't even seek the job out. He emailed 5 people that he thought would be good for it. I interviewed and he selected me. So it was a cool job. I got to see and experience a lot. I worked with the chairman and the board members. I got to sit in on interviews of parole board members interviewing, Department of Correction inmates to get their parole. And that's not something that a lot of people ever see, even parole agents. Then after being the executive assistant for 1.5 years, I was selected by the director of parole field services to be the parole manager of the interstate unit and then the extradition unit. These were 2 exceedingly complex and fast-paced management jobs. They really pushed me outside my comfort zone. But at the same time, they made me realize how much I could accomplish and what I was really capable of if I really pushed myself. And honestly, I didn't really want either of these jobs. I actually just wanted to go back to being a parole agent because I like law enforcement, and they were actually in the process of putting me in the Harrisburg district office. They gave me my equipment back, including my gun, and had me do my training. But then God intervened. Through a series of happenings and circumstances far beyond my control, I was thrust into this new daunting and demanding trial. But I later realized why God put me here, and I'll explain that a little bit more later. And after doing my time behind a desk for 3.5 years, including the executive assistant job and the parole manager jobs, God moved me to an amazing law enforcement job. It is such an awesome job filled with excitement and adventure. But God had to divinely intervene once again in order for me to get the job. My state parole connections introduced me to the right people. You've heard the saying, it's all about who you know. Well, hear this. It's all about the people that God brings into your life. Once I was hired, I had to attend one of the most hardcore police academies in the entire country. The place is a strictly regimented paramilitary boot camp. And before I got in, I had to pass a swim test. I had to swim 250 yards without stopping and tread water for 5 minutes. I was a very weak swimmer, so I had to train and practice really hard to pass that test. And even then, I just barely passed. Once in the academy, swimming was a big part of it, and I felt overwhelmed, especially when we first started. There were days where I felt like I just couldn't even keep going. I felt like I was going to drown. I really had to push myself. We'd get in the pool and we'd have to do 4 laps, 3 laps, 2 laps, 4 laps, and it just wouldn't stop. They really smoked us in the pool. Sometimes they would even throw 60 or 70 people in the pool at once. And it became a mosh pit of like elbows and kicks while you're just trying to get to the end of the pool. I felt so overwhelmed, but I was able to push through it. I had to really dig deep down to find the courage that was deep within me, and I couldn't have done it without God's help. The first week at the academy was rough. We were pushed to our physical limits, and 3 people in my class actually dropped out. And a lot of us were nervous about, am I going to be the one who's next? And it didn't get any easier, but God kept giving me signs that everything was going to be okay. While I was at the academy, or while I was on the way there or back home for the weekend, I kept seeing these rainbows and double rainbows. And actually, I think it was the second week, one time I walked out and there was a double rainbow on the academy grounds, beginning in one spot and ending in the other spot on the academy grounds. So that rainbow was meant for all of us in the academy. In the Bible, rainbows are a sign of God's promises, of his faithfulness. Anyway, God got me through that year of training, and now I'm a state law enforcement officer. I love helping people and serving my community, and I love the community policing aspect of it too. I love doing school programs and talking to kids about law enforcement. And the thing is, this shouldn't even be possible. The field of law enforcement is insanely competitive. It's been that way for the past few decades, and it's still that way, even with the current law enforcement crisis. Anyone with any minor blemishes on their record is going to have a struggle getting in. Anyone with drug use is going to have an uphill battle. But anyone with drug use and multiple arrests, that's almost impossible. Ask any law enforcement official who's in charge of hiring. They'll tell you it's almost impossible. But here's the cool thing with God. He controls the entire universe. So if you are with him and you accept his will for your life, he will be able to open doors for you that you couldn't open in the natural. You will be able to bypass seemingly insurmountable obstacles if it's God's will for you to surmount them. I faced a lot of rejection. Philly PD, local PDs in Pennsylvania, local PDs outside Pennsylvania, various state police agencies. It hurt a lot, but you know what I realized? Rejection is just God's way of saying wrong direction. When one door closes, another one opens. Whatever you lost in this life, God will make up for it. And you know, there's actually a really cool verse in the Bible about those who have been through a lot of trouble in their lives. They actually get restored and get double what they would have gotten had they never messed up in the first place. How cool is that? God will give you double for your trouble. Never feel bad about anything or anyone that rejects you. You weren't meant for it. You were meant for something far greater. Satan will always try to destroy something before it begins. For example, I wanted to be in law enforcement as a kid, but throughout my life, because of various temptations and what I thought was actually great, I sacrificed that. And I spent about a decade taking back what belongs to me. The insidious thing about Satan is that he doesn't directly destroy our lives. He tempts us and seduces us with false promises. And that's what happened to me. Satan took everything from me because I let him. There are so many times when I felt hopeless, hopeless with regard to my career, my relationships. I would ask God why. I would curse him because I didn't understand what was going on. But I should have never worried because God always came through on everything. Housing, finances, relationships, my career. And God has always given me favor with the right people, people who can promote me and advance me and make my circumstances better and help me achieve my God-given destiny. And every time that I was in grave danger, God always came down and rescued me. Every time that I was in the darkest of pits, God reached his hand down and lifted me up. Good always conquers evil. The way that it almost always plays out is that evil has the upper hand. It seems that the forces of darkness have all the power, and the good guys are totally outmatched and hopeless. But in the end, good always conquers evil. I have worshipped many counterfeit gods throughout my life. People-pleasing, acceptance, women, relationships, being a law enforcement officer, prestige. But the problem is I was putting all these first and not God. They ended up enslaving me and making me miserable. And that's because whenever you worship something that's not God, when it inevitably rejects you, you feel completely despondent and hopeless. It feels like your whole world has been shattered. But God will never reject you, and that's because he loves you. God is the only entity that you should ever worship. Now, a counterfeit God can be anything. It can be a job, a car, a relationship, whatever. And these things aren't bad in and of themselves, but the problem is when they take first place in your heart. You end up sacrificing everything to your counterfeit gods. And make no mistake, counterfeit gods will take everything from you. Counterfeit gods of acceptance and people-pleasing cost me my law enforcement career, possibly for life, but thanks to God's divine intervention, it was only for a decade. The counterfeit gods of women, a relationship, prestige, and being a law enforcement officer cost me my peace of mind for about a decade. The biggest counterfeit god that I've struggled with is the counterfeit god of me. And that's a counterfeit god that we all struggle with. We're all so concerned with making sure everyone loves and respects us and making sure that we get everything we want. But the kingdom of heaven is more than food and drink. And what that means is that you can't always get what you want. God knows what is best for you. Trust him, do his will, and he'll take care of you better than you ever could. Whenever we worship ourselves, we're actually worshiping Satan. And that's because we become what we worship. Satan was the first person to worship himself. So whenever we worship ourselves, we essentially become one with Satan, part of the whole evil collective that is the kingdom of darkness. In the Lord's Prayer, we say, "Thy will be done, not my will be done." Worshiping anything other than God brings feelings of emptiness and despair, and the end of the road is always death. And worshiping other people's approval may feel good because people like you, but it's transactional. They only like you because of what you're doing, not because of who you actually are. Now, you can say that God is first in your life, but what if God withholds something important from you? What if he takes something from you? What if you never get what you want? Will you still love God? Don't be surprised if God tests you in one or more of these ways. He wants to see how you'll act. This is what happened with the parole management jobs. I was so angry at God for intervening in my affairs. But then I just went along with that. I just said, okay, you know what, I'm just going to accept his will, and I'm just going to do things God's way. And then he ended up putting me in one of the best law enforcement jobs I could have ever asked for. Job much better than just being a parole agent, which is what my plan was. You know, God just wants to see if you'll do things his way, and then he will bless you abundantly if you do. That's what happened with me. In addition to getting a great law enforcement job, I've just been showered with blessings these past few years. I can't get away from them. They keep chasing me down. Matthew 6:33, but seek first the kingdom of heaven, and all these other things shall be added unto you. What that means is that if you keep God first, God will give you everything that you want anyway. I feel so free and at peace. I feel like I've been in a prison most of my life, a prison that Satan makes for all of us and that we willingly enter. I've spent my whole life being obsessed with getting everything that I want, making sure everyone likes me, and worshiping everything that's not God. And I can't tell you how anxious and miserable that made me. I eventually reached points where I said to God, you know what? I'm okay if I never become a law enforcement officer. Okay if I never have a girlfriend or relationship, that's okay. I learned to just accept God's will for me and to focus on God. And I learned to embrace the pain in my life because I realized that pain was always temporary. It came and it went. Plus, it got me closer to God, and I realized that I could always use my pain to help others who were suffering in the same way. The stakes are higher than anything that you could possibly imagine. Heaven or hell, an eternity of pure bliss, joy, contentment, and peace with God, or an eternity of pain, suffering, misery, anguish, and regret. Just you, the devil, and everyone else who chose to worship and serve themselves instead of worshiping God and serving others. I am in a war, and so are you.